A small-town judge thought he'd crush a simple teacher who dared to criticize him, but within just one courtroom hearing, he ended up facing career-ending exposure, and it all unraveled faster than anyone imagined. Stay with me because you won't believe how a humble literature teacher dismantled an entire corrupt system with nothing but her wits and her quiet strength. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us where in the world are you watching from today. And if you believe in standing up for justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Now, it was just an ordinary Tuesday morning when everything began to change. Emma Lawson buttoned up her simple burgundy sweater, the same one she always wore when she needed a little extra courage, and glanced at the stack of lesson plans on her desk. The early October air had that crisp bite, the kind that hinted at coming storms, though the skies outside Westridge High were deceptively clear. She loved this time of year, loved the crackle of possibility that seemed to spark with every falling leaf. What she didn't know yet was that possibility would soon turn into battle. As she gathered her things, the bell rang, sending a wave of restless seniors into her classroom. They dropped into their seats with the usual mix of boredom and teenage energy, backpacks hitting the floor with thuds, sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. Emma smiled softly. She loved these kids not because they were perfect, but because they weren't. They were raw, unfinished stories still trying to write their own beginnings. She picked up a dry erase marker and scrawled across the whiteboard, "Symbolism in Modern Literature." A few groans echoed from the back of the room. Emma turned ready for the familiar debate. Miss Lawson, Jeremy called out, slouching in his chair with the easy defiance of someone counting minutes until lunch. "Can't we just read the book and not analyze every little thing? It's just a story, right?" A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Emma only smiled, setting down the marker. She leaned against the desk, crossing her arms casually. "That's actually a profound question, Jeremy," she said. Her voice was calm but filled with an energy that made even the most disinterested heads lift a little. Literature isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror. Every symbol, every metaphor is a reflection of justice, truth, human experience. When you learn to read between the lines, you don't just understand stories, you understand the world. The words hung in the air a moment longer than usual, and she saw it, that tiny flicker of engagement, even from the kids who usually tuned her out. That was why she stayed. That was why, no matter what, she would keep teaching. The bell rang again, loud and abrupt, shattering the quiet moment. Students filed out, some stopping to mutter a quick thanks or see ya before disappearing into the hallways. Emma sighed, her muscles loosening slightly as the classroom emptied. She bent down to organize the papers strewn across her desk until something caught her eye. A copy of the school newspaper lay abandoned on a chair. Its headline blared in bold black ink, "Local Judge's Controversial Decision Diverts School Funding." Emma's stomach tightened as she picked it up, the memory flashing sharp and immediate. The town hall meeting 2 weeks ago, the packed auditorium, the way her voice had trembled at first before finding its footing. She hadn't intended to speak that night. But when Judge Franklin Pierce smugly announced the reallocation of public education funds to a private development project, something inside her snapped. Standing there in front of the town council and half the community, she had challenged him not with emotion, but with precision. She cited case law. She questioned the interpretation of statutes. She pointed out the breach of public trust. She had watched the judge's face redden, his jaw clench, but she hadn't backed down. Afterwards, several parents thanked her. A few shook her hand. She had gone home thinking she had done something good. Apparently, Judge Pierce disagreed. Later that afternoon, in the stale, fluorescent light of the teacher's lounge, Emma sipped weak coffee and tried to ignore the sideways glances Diane, her colleague and sometimes confidant, slid into the chair beside her and leaned in. "Heard you stirred things up pretty good at that meeting," Diane said under her breath. Emma shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just spoke the truth. What Judge Pierce did might be technically legal, but it's morally wrong. Those funds were meant for our students." Diane gave her a long look, the kind that was both admiration and warning. "You ruffled some important feathers." "Emma, Pierce has friends everywhere." Emma forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. "I'm just a high school literature teacher. What's he gonna do? Sue me for having an opinion." But deep down, something cold and uneasy coiled in her chest. Power didn't like to be challenged, and men like Franklin Pierce didn't forget who embarrassed them or forgive. Driving home, the autumn sun blinding on the horizon, Emma's thoughts drifted not to school, but to her grandfather. The man who had raised her to believe in fairness, who had taught her that the law was supposed to protect the vulnerable, not empower the already powerful. His old law books still lined her living room shelves, their spines cracked and faded from decades of use. She hadn't followed him into the courtroom. After graduating from law school, top of her class, she realized she didn't have the stomach for politics disguised as justice. Teaching felt purer, cleaner. If she couldn't fight the system from the inside, she could at least teach the next generation how to see through it. When she got home, she kicked off her shoes, intending to grade essays and maybe catch up on a few chapters of the new novel she'd started. The answering machine blinked red, an anachronism she stubbornly refused to replace with a digital voicemail. Beep! A male voice clipped and official. Miss Lawson, this is the clerk from the municipal court. You are being summoned regarding your recent traffic violation. Please appear before Judge Franklin Pierce this Friday at 9:00 a.m. Emma's brow furrowed. Traffic violation. She racked her brain and remembered the minor ticket from a few weeks ago, a rolling stop near the high school. She had paid it online the same day. It should have been settled. Frowning, she opened her laptop and dug through her emails until she found the confirmation payment processed, case closed. A small knot of unease began to form in her stomach. She stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, at the mechanical certainty of the system telling her one thing while reality seemed to whisper something far more sinister. She checked the court's website, re-entered her citation number. Same result, paid, resolved. No court appearance scheduled. So why was she being summoned? The answer, she realized with a sick certainty, had nothing to do with a rolling stop sign. It had everything to do with speaking out, in a courthouse lined with marble and mahogany behind doors. Carved with the town's crest, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Judge Franklin Pierce sat at his massive desk, a file folder marked Lawson. Emma spread open in front of him. His clerk, Gerald, hovered nearby, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Did you send the summons? Pierce asked without looking up. Yes, sir, Gerald said, but she paid the fine. There's no reason for her to appear. Pierce's lips curled into a thin smile. There's always a reason, Gerald. She needs to learn a lesson about respect. But, sir, if anyone looks, no one will look, Pierce snapped, finally raising his icy blue eyes. No one ever does. He leaned back, hands steepled beneath his chin, already savoring the image. Emma Lawson standing before him, embarrassed, humiliated, forced to acknowledge his authority, forced to remember her place. But what Judge Pierce didn't realize was that Emma Lawson's place was not beneath him, and she was about to remind him and the entire town exactly why Emma sat by her living room window that night, a cooling cup of tea forgotten in her hands, her eyes following the movement of the wind through the maple trees outside. The summons replayed in her mind like a crackling old record, each repetition grinding a little deeper into her nerves. She knew this was more than a clerical error. It was too deliberate, too timely. But knowing something and proving it were two very different battles, and she had learned long ago that accusations without proof could turn even friends into strangers. The faint creak of the old bookshelf caught her attention, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. Her grandfather's law books lined the shelves like silent sentinels, their leather spines weathered but strong. She rose and ran her fingers across them, feeling the impressions of decades-old embossing. Her grandfather had once told her that knowledge of the law was like armor, invisible, silent but powerful if worn properly. She had shrugged it off back then, too eager to escape the courtroom. Wars he fought daily. Now standing there in the quiet of her modest apartment, she realized just how naked she had allowed herself to become. She pulled down a volume almost at random, Fundamentals of Due Process, and thumbed through its yellowed pages. Words and phrases leapt out at her. Impartial tribunal. Right to notification. Protection against arbitrary exercise of power. Each phrase felt like a distant voice calling her back to something she had once known intimately, but had let fade into the background of lesson plans and grading rubrics. A memory surfaced unbidden, her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, spectacles perched on his nose. His voice steady and low as he explained a case to her teenage self. It's not about winning, Emma, he had said. It's about making sure the powerful know someone's watching. She closed the book gently and placed it on the coffee table. That was the real reason she had left law behind, wasn't it? Not because she lacked the ability, she had graduated summa cum laude, but because she doubted the fight could ever be clean. And yet here she was called once again into a battle she had tried so hard to avoid. Across the room, her phone buzzed. Diane's name flashed on the screen. Emma picked up on the third ring, trying to mask the exhaustion in her voice. Hey, she said. Emma? Diane's voice was tight, urgent. You need to know something. Principal Stevens, he's been asking around about you. Quietly questions about your professional conduct. Emma's fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of questions? Whether you've been discussing political issues in class, whether you've encouraged students to criticize local government decisions. A hot wave of anger flushed through her veins. That's absurd. She said, I teach To Kill a Mockingbird, Diane. Of course we talk about justice and fairness. I know, Diane said quickly. But it's not about what's true, Emma. It's about what people are willing to believe if they're scared enough. Emma thanked her and hung up the walls of her cozy living room, suddenly feeling smaller. Closer, the trap was bigger than she had realized. It wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about character assassination inch by inch until she was isolated and powerless. She turned back to the window. The wind had picked up, shaking the branches with a force that rattled against the glass. Somewhere deep inside, a decision anchored itself firmly into place. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. The next morning, Emma didn't go to school. She called in a personal day, her voice measured and neutral as she spoke to the school secretary. No explanation offered, none needed. By the time she hung up, she had already started a checklist in her mind, methodical and relentless. If Pierce wanted to turn the machinery of the system against her, she would arm herself with the one thing he underestimated, the truth sharpened to a point fine enough to pierce through arrogance and lies. Her first stop was the county law library, an aging brick building wedged between a bank and an insurance office downtown. Inside, the air smelled of dust and paper. A forgotten fortress in an age that worshipped the digital misses. Finch, the elderly librarian, looked up from her desk with a surprised smile. Miss Lawson, she said, adjusting her glasses, it's been years. Emma smiled back. I need to research a few things. Do you still keep municipal case transcripts here? Mrs. Finch nodded, tapping the counter with a manicured nail. Public records section, back corner. Let me know if you need help. Emma spent hours combing through case files, cross-referencing contempt charges issued by Judge Pierce over the past 5 years. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, like the faint outline of a path through dense woods, but then unmistakable. Almost every citizen who had dared to challenge or criticize him publicly had found themselves suddenly facing petty legal troubles. Parking violations escalated into court summons. Minor code infractions ballooned into hearings. None of the cases made headlines. None seemed outrageous on their own, but together they painted a chilling mosaic of intimidation. She scribbled notes furiously, feeling an old fire reignite in her chest, the same fire that once had driven her through torturous hours of constitutional law, seminars and case briefings. Later, as the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, she found what she didn't even know. She was searching for a case involving a young reporter named Maria Gonzalez. Maria had published an expose about local corruption tied to Pierce's friends in the development business. Weeks later, Maria was charged with contempt after missing a mandatory hearing. Notice she claimed never arrived. Sound familiar? Emma made copies of everything, stuffing them into her leather satchel with trembling hands. This wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. By the time she got home, the sky was bruising to a deep purple. She sat at her kitchen table surrounded by scattered papers and highlighted documents. Her laptop hummed quietly beside her. She opened a blank document and began drafting, not an essay, not a lesson plan, but a motion. She hadn't passed the bar exam, hadn't practiced a day in her life, but law school had taught her one unbreakable truth. Procedure mattered. Even corrupt judges couldn't ignore properly filed motions without risking exposure. As she typed, her mind flicked through strategies. If she attacked Pierce head-on, he would crush her. She needed to fight on ground. He didn't expect using the law itself as both sword and shield. Around midnight, Emma leaned back in her chair, her eyes gritty with exhaustion, but her mind razor-sharp. She had outlined the beginnings of a procedural defense, highlighting the irregularities in her notification process, referencing precedents about due process violations, and citing municipal rules about proof of service. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real solid, and it would force Pierce into a corner he hadn't prepared for. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark Chen, a former student, now an investigative journalist for a local paper. She had texted him earlier asking if he knew any reporters still willing to look into small-town corruption. Just finished my shift, heard some things about Pierce, call me when you can. Urgent. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the message for a long moment, then hit dial. Miss Lawson? Mark's voice was quick, clipped with excitement. You won't believe the number of people who've complained about him. Small stuff, no one wanted to push it, but it's there. I've started compiling names. If you want to go public, we have a case. Emma closed her eyes, letting the words settle over her like armor, clicking into place. Tomorrow she would walk into that courtroom. Alone, technically, but she would not be defenseless, and she would not be silent. Tomorrow, Franklin Pierce would learn exactly what kind of woman he had tried to break, and he would not like the answer. Emma slept little that night. The few hours she managed to rest were filled with restless dreams, faceless judges, hammering gavels, empty classrooms echoing with unseen accusations, winding hallways she couldn't escape. When she awoke just before dawn, the sky was still ink dark, and a chill clung to the corners of her modest apartment like a warning. She moved on instinct now, packing her grandfather's leather briefcase with meticulous care, copies of case law, highlighted municipal procedures, every scrap of documentation she had gathered the day before. She tucked away the motion she had drafted. Still unfinished but serviceable, folded with precise creases, as if the neatness could somehow anchor her resolve. In the small mirror above her kitchen sink, she caught a glimpse of herself. Hair pulled back, eyes shadowed but sharp, the burgundy sweater clean and pressed. For the first time in a long while, she saw not just a teacher, but the woman she had once believed she could become, deliberate, prepared, and utterly unwilling to be bullied into silence. Before leaving, she sent one final text to Mark Chen, heading to the courthouse today. If anything happens, make sure the truth gets out. She didn't wait for a reply. The drive downtown was short, but every red light, every stop sign felt heavy with implication. It seemed absurd that the world outside continued as normal commuters sipping coffee, children with backpacks laughing on sidewalks, while inside her, a storm was tightening, pulling her breath taut with anticipation. When she reached the courthouse parking lot, she turned off the ignition, but stayed seated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. Across the street, reporters loitered near the front steps, though none paid her any attention. Good. Let them underestimate her. She walked inside. Her steps measured, her face composed. The cold marble of the building seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Emma nodded politely at the security officers, passed through the metal detector without incident, and climbed the stone stairs to the second-floor courtroom where her hearing was scheduled. Inside, a scattering of other defendants and their attorneys milled about, murmuring in low voices. Emma chose a seat in the back, placing her briefcase carefully on her lap. She opened it just enough to check that everything was still there, her notes, her evidence, her contingency plan, tucked into a sealed manila envelope marked for the State Judicial Review Board only. She had no illusions about what today would be. It would not be fair. It would not be easy. But she would be ready. As she waited, she noticed Gerald Judge Pierce's clerk bustling around the front of the courtroom. His movements were nervous, almost twitchy, and twice she saw him glance in her direction without meeting her eyes. Her instincts sharpened. Gerald knew something. Whether he would ever admit it was another matter. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the heavy doors at the side of the room opened, and Judge Franklin Pierce entered his black robe, billowing slightly as he ascended the bench. His face was a mask of impassive authority, but Emma caught the slight tightening around his mouth when he spotted her. The session began briskly. Names were called. Minor cases were heard and disposed of within minutes. A petty theft charge dismissed. A parking fine negotiated down. It was all routine, efficient, the machinery of small-town justice grinding forward without pause. And then, docket number 47B, Lawson Emma, failure to appear and contempt of court. Emma rose and walked steadily to the defendant's table. The murmur of the courtroom faded to a hush. Somewhere near the back, she caught a flash of movement. Mark Chen slipping into a seat with a notepad in hand. Judge Pierce peered down at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. Miss Lawson, he said, voice dripping with manufactured civility. You have been summoned here today to answer charges of failing to appear for a scheduled court date regarding a traffic violation and for subsequent contempt of this court. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Emma replied, her voice calm, steady. Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected fear. Deference. Instead, she stood poised, unflinching, her hands resting lightly on the worn leather of her briefcase. You may proceed, he said almost lazily, as if granting a favor. Emma opened her briefcase with deliberate slowness, drawing out a folder. Your Honor, she began. I respectfully submit that the charges brought against me are based on procedural irregularities that violate my right to due process under both state law and municipal court rules. A ripple of movement passed through the gallery. Pierce stiffened but said nothing. I have here, Emma continued, holding up the printout, a copy of my original traffic citation issued on October 1st. It contains no indication that a court appearance was required, and upon receipt, I immediately paid the stated fine through the court's online system on October 3rd. Here is the confirmation of that payment. She handed the documents to Gerald, who after a visible hesitation brought them to the judge. Pierce skimmed them with feigned indifference. Payment does not excuse appearance when required, he said brusquely. You should have been notified of a mandatory hearing. If I may, Your Honor, Emma pressed, I respectfully request to see the documented proof that such a notification was properly served as required under Municipal Rule 73 subsection C. Silence fell over the room. Even the stenographer's fingers hovered above her keys, waiting. Pierce's jaw clenched. He gestured sharply to Gerald. Produce the service record. The clerk fumbled with a file, pulling out a flimsy printout. Emma stepped forward, requesting permission to examine it. A request Pierce could hardly deny without drawing suspicion. The document was riddled with irregularities. No server signature, no delivery receipt, no confirmation of mailing. Just a single checkbox marked notification sent, dated 3 days before her supposed missed hearing. Your Honor, Emma said, carefully controlling her voice. With respect, this document does not meet the legal standard for proof of service. Without proper notice, any finding of contempt would violate both my procedural rights and constitutional guarantees of due process. Murmurs now filled the room. Pierce banged his gavel once, a sharp crack that echoed off the marble. This court will not be lectured on procedure by a schoolteacher, he snapped. Emma met his glare without flinching. I do not intend to lecture Your Honor. I intend to assert my rights as guaranteed under the law. The tension in the room was electric. She could see it in the way even the public defenders leaned forward slightly. Sensing the seismic shift beneath the sterile proceedings, Pierce opened his mouth, no doubt to dismiss her concerns. But then the courtroom doors opened and 2 men in suits entered, quietly flashing badges at the bailiff. Emma's heart skipped. She had not called them, someone else had. Maybe Mark, maybe another journalist she didn't know about yet. Maybe justice itself had started to pay attention. The judge faltered, words dying on his tongue. As the 2 men took seats near the front, their expressions unreadable, but their presence impossible to ignore. Emma took a breath and moved to the final part of her defense. In addition, Your Honor, she said, voice rising enough to carry, there appears to be a concerning pattern regarding the court's treatment of individuals who have exercised their First Amendment rights to speak critically about public officials. I have documented multiple cases where citizens faced unusual legal troubles shortly after public criticisms of decisions related to your court. I respectfully request that these concerns be referred to the appropriate oversight authorities for review. Gasps rippled across the room. Even Gerald had gone pale. Judge Pierce slammed his gavel again, harder this time. Enough. This hearing is not a forum for baseless accusations. Emma bowed her head slightly. Understood, Your Honor. I simply wish to ensure the record was complete for potential appellate review. The threat hung there, heavy and undeniable. Pierce knew exactly what she was saying. Deny her motion improperly, and it would not end here. It would escalate, publicly. He glared at her for a long moment, wrestling with calculation and rage. Finally, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Motion to dismiss granted, case closed." Emma exhaled slowly as she gathered her things. But in her chest, it wasn't relief she felt. It was a sharpening resolve. This wasn't over. Not yet. Today she had defended herself. Tomorrow she would start defending everyone else who hadn't been able to fight back. The courthouse door swung closed behind Emma. With a heavy echoing thud, outside the morning air had turned brittle and cold, and for a moment she just stood there on the courthouse steps, letting the chill cut through her sweater. Around her, the town moved obliviously forward, cars humming by, pedestrians hurrying about their errands, a world too busy to notice the small war that had just played out in its midst. Emma clutched her briefcase tighter, a tremor running through her hands now that the immediate battle was over. She had won the day. Yes, but the war was far from finished. Judge Pierce's eyes in those last moments hadn't just held anger. They had held calculation, the promise of retribution. He was a man who didn't lose quietly. Mark Chen caught up to her halfway down the courthouse steps. "That was incredible," he said breathlessly. "You gutted him, in public. No one's ever done that before." Emma offered a wan smile but said nothing. Praise felt hollow when she knew the retaliation would be just beginning. Mark hesitated, sensing her mood. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I've been digging deeper. There's more stuff that could really hurt him. But it's risky. For both of us." Emma met his gaze steadily. "I didn't start this," she said, "but I'm not going to run from it either." He nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "Good, I'll keep you posted." They parted ways at the curb. Emma made it back to her car without incident. But as she pulled into the street, a black sedan she didn't recognize slipped in behind her, keeping a careful distance. She watched it in her rearview mirror all the way home. At her apartment, she drew the blinds tightly, double-locked the door, and sat in the middle of the living room, the walls pressing inward with a suffocating sense of siege. She tried grading papers, tried reading, but her mind kept circling back to the same grim reality. Pierce wouldn't stop at legal maneuvering. If he couldn't defeat her in court, he would dismantle her another way. The first blow came that evening, not with violence but with precision. An email from Principal Stevens marked urgent. She opened it with a sinking feeling, "Miss Lawson. It has come to my attention via concerns expressed by the superintendent's office that certain classroom materials may be considered politically sensitive and inappropriate for our educational environment. As such, you are placed on administrative review, effective immediately pending investigation. Please refrain from contacting students or staff until further notice." Emma stared at the screen, the words blurring politically sensitive, inappropriate. She had taught To Kill a Mockingbird, Animal Farm, 1984 classics that had been part of the curriculum for decades. But now suddenly they were ammunition against her. Her hands shook as she typed a terse acknowledgement and logged off. Her career, the life she had spent 10 years building, was slipping through her fingers. Not because she had failed in her duties, but because she had dared to speak truth. The second blow followed the next morning. A thick envelope appeared in her mailbox, anonymous. No return address. Inside were printed copies of online forum posts, cherry-picked and distorted out of context. Comments she had made over the years, advocating for educational funding, criticizing local corruption, discussing historical injustices. Nothing illegal, nothing even particularly inflammatory. But spun correctly, they painted her as a radical and agitator. She imagined how the school board would react, how the town gossip mill would devour and twist it. Already she felt the invisible walls closing in. Emma sat heavily on her couch, staring at the scattered pages. The silence around her was immense, almost physical. A knock at the door startled her so badly she dropped the papers. She approached cautiously, heart hammering, and peered through the peephole. It was Diane. Emma opened the door halfway, the chain still engaged. "Can I come in?" Diana asked quietly. Emma hesitated, then unlatched the door and stepped aside. Diane entered, looking around as if expecting watchers even here. She clutched a plain manila envelope to her chest. "I shouldn't be here," she said in a low voice, "but I couldn't just do nothing." Emma's throat tightened painfully. "They're going after my job, Diane, my reputation. Everything." "I know," Diane said. She set the envelope down on the coffee table with a trembling hand. "That's why you need to see this." Inside were copies of internal school district emails, messages between the superintendent, members of the school board, and several influential town figures. They discussed Emma openly, dissecting her town hall speech, her teaching methods, her supposed disloyalty to community leadership. One line stood out starkly. "We must ensure that educators understand the importance of supporting local institutions or else replace them with more cooperative personnel." Emma felt something deep inside her, something that had survived the court hearings, the threats, the isolation finally crack. "This isn't just about me anymore," she whispered. "It's about every teacher, every student who will be forced to swallow lies because someone in power decided truth was inconvenient." Diane looked at her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What are you going to do?" Emma stood slowly, her mind already racing ahead. "I'm going to fight," she said simply, "not just for myself, for every voice they're trying to silence." It would cost her, she knew, that reputation, friends, maybe even her home, her livelihood. But some battles weren't about survival. Some were about standing up so others would know they could too. As night fell, Emma sat back down at her kitchen table. She spread out everything before her. The courtroom transcripts, the emails Diane had risked so much to bring the contempt charges against others she had unearthed at the library. Each piece was small on its own, but woven together they formed a tapestry of corruption too large to ignore. She drafted letters to the State Judicial Review Board, the Department of Education, the local newspaper, even a civil rights organization she had admired from afar for years but never dared to contact. She knew Pierce would retaliate harder now. He would marshal every ally, every weapon in his arsenal. She would become a symbol, a warning. But Emma Lawson had spent her life teaching young people about courage and integrity. She would not abandon those lessons now when they mattered most. When she finally crawled into bed exhausted, but strangely calm, she allowed herself one small thought before sleep overtook her. It had started with a rolling stop. It would end with a reckoning. The rain started sometime after midnight, a slow, deliberate tapping against the windows, like the world itself had decided to weep alongside her. Emma lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She hadn't cried yet. Not when she was suspended. Not when she received the envelope of lies. Not even when she realized her name was being dragged through whispered conversations all across town. But now, in the aching quiet of her apartment, with the steady percussion of the rain like a heartbeat, she couldn't match the tears came, hot and furious, sliding down her cheeks and soaking the edge of her pillow. For the first time, the thought crossed her mind. Maybe I can't win this. Maybe Judge Pierce was too powerful. Maybe the system was too rigged. Maybe the damage to her career, her reputation, her life was already too deep to undo. The briefcase sat at the foot of her bed, stuffed with evidence plans names. It looked ridiculous now. A child's sword in a battle against armored giants. She curled into herself, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, wishing she could disappear into it, wishing she could go back to being just a teacher, anonymous and safe, never having raised her voice, never having stepped into the light where powerful men could see her. The darkness stretched on hour after hour until the lines between night and dawn blurred into a gray nothingness. At some point, without thinking, she pulled one of her grandfather's old law journals off the shelf. It was cracked and fragile, the pages yellowed, the ink faded. She turned pages absently, not really reading, just touching the words he had once cared enough to write. Near the back, a loose piece of newspaper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Emma bent to pick it up. It was a clipping, all the edges brittle. A black and white photo showed her grandfather standing outside a small courthouse, arm around a woman who was weeping openly. The caption read, "Local attorney John Lawson successfully defends town protester against unlawful charges." She turned the clipping over. Scrawled in her grandfather's looping handwriting were just 5 words: "Stand for the ones who can't." Emma sat back heavily, the paper trembling in her hands. It wasn't about winning. It had never been about winning. It was about standing. Even if she lost her job, even if the town turned against her, even if it meant starting over from nothing. If she didn't fight, who would be next? Which student? Which teacher? Which parent who dared to raise their voice against injustice? She pressed the clipping to her heart, shutting her eyes, letting the rain and her grandfather's memory seep into her bloodstream like arms. At that moment, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She wiped her face and reached for it, expecting another blow, another piece of bad news. But it was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Lawson, this is Claire Bennett. You don't know me, but I heard what happened. My brother, he faced something similar years ago with Judge Pierce. I thought no one would ever fight back. Thank you. Please call me. I can help." Emma stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Help? Not pity. Not warning. Not apology. Help. She hesitated for only a moment before hitting call. The phone rang twice before a warm, steady voice answered. "Miss Lawson." "Yes?" Emma said, her voice rough from hours of silence. "I'm Claire," the woman said. "I've been following what's happening to you. You're braver than you realize." Emma closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the kindness like sunlight against frozen skin. "You said you could help." "I can," Claire said. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a reporter, but I have something else. I'm a researcher. I know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. Pierce has been careful for years, too. Careful for amateurs to catch him, but he made mistakes. I can show you." Emma's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why now?" "Because you're not an amateur," Claire said gently. "You understand the system. You know how to fight it from the inside out. You're the first person who's made him bleed. And because people like me, the quiet ones, we're tired of watching bullies win." Emma felt a sob catch in her throat, not from sadness this time, but from the unbearable pressure of hope. "Tell me what you have," she said, her voice stronger. Claire explained quickly. Financial records, shady real estate deals tied to Pierce's rulings, connections between the judge and private developers, the manipulation of civic boards. It was a spider web, intricate and deadly. But now there was a thread leading straight to the heart. "I can send you the documents," Claire said. "Off the record, what you do with them is up to you." Maman didn't hesitate. "Send everything?" By sunrise, Emma's inbox was overflowing. She printed page after page, spreading them across her living room floor like a giant damning puzzle. Each document fit with another. Each email trail lined up with public records. Each judicial decision linked back to private gains. The picture was grotesque in its simplicity. Pierce wasn't just a bully. He was a businessman in a robe selling verdicts for influence, bending justice to fatten his allies' pockets, and now, thanks to Claire, Emma had the blueprint. She worked all day, cross-referencing, annotating, building a case so solid even the most compromised oversight board would be forced to act. She didn't allow herself time to second-guess or falter. She had slipped past despair now beyond fear, beyond self-pity into something colder and harder and far more dangerous resolve that evening. As the first stars blinked cautiously into the bruised sky, Emma sat at her kitchen table with the final draft of her complaint. It was not just a defense anymore. It was an indictment. She would file it tomorrow. Quietly, no fanfare, no warning. She would give Pierce no chance to mount a preemptive strike. When the hammer fell, it would fall swift and public and devastating. Emma looked once more at the photo of her grandfather, still tucked beside her laptop. "I'm not fighting for myself anymore," she whispered aloud. The words felt right. Whole, she gathered the files into her grandfather's battered briefcase, closed the latch with a decisive snap, and set it by the door. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end, and this time it would not be her end, it would be his. The courthouse smelled of floor polish and old paper when Emma walked in just after 8 a.m. Her grandfather's briefcase gripped tightly in her hand. She wore her simplest clothes, dark jeans and navy blazer, no jewelry, no makeup, nothing to distract or draw attention. She was just another citizen filing paperwork. Nothing more. The clerk at the counter looked up with disinterest as Emma approached. "I need to submit a formal complaint to the State Judicial Review Board." Emma said, her voice steady. The woman blinked as if surprised. Most people who crossed the courthouse threshold were here to pay fines, not light matches. Emma laid the documents on the counter, one by one, the financial reports, the emails, the connections drawn in crisp annotated lines. Atop the pile sat her own sworn affidavit, carefully worded, precise, citing not only her own mistreatment, but the broader abuses she had unearthed. The clerk flipped through the first few pages, her brows knitting slightly, then stamped the intake form without comment. "Anything else?" she asked. Emma shook her head. "No, that's all." "Processing usually takes about a week," the clerk added, almost as an afterthought. Emma gave a tight smile. "I can wait." She stepped back into the morning sunlight, feeling curiously weightless, as if part of the burden she had been carrying for weeks had been physically lifted. Filing the complaint didn't guarantee justice. She knew better than to believe that. But it was a move that couldn't be undone, a stone dropped into still water that would send ripples in every direction. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked down Main Street past the bakery, where she used to buy muffins for her students on Fridays, past the bookstore, with the crooked awning, past the cafe where teachers gathered on weekends. And as she walked, she saw the subtle but unmistakable shift. People turned to glance at her as she passed. Some quickly looked away. Others held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary. Their expressions tight, unreadable word was spreading. She paused at the bulletin board outside the town hall. Taped up among the community announcements and lost pet notices was a freshly printed flyer. Concerned Citizens Forum, maintaining respect for public institutions. Guest speaker, Judge Franklin Pierce. Scheduled for Friday night, 2 days from now. Emma stared at the flyer bile rising in her throat. The forum wasn't about education or civic engagement. It was a preemptive strike, a public relations campaign designed to frame her as the enemy before she could frame him. She pulled out her phone and texted Mark Chen. "New event Friday. He's trying to control the narrative. I need coverage." Mark's reply came almost instantly. "Already heard. I'll be there, so will others. Stay strong. Emma folded the flyer into her pocket and continued walking, her steps brisk, now anger giving her momentum. By noon, she was sitting across from Claire Bennett at a tiny diner on the edge of town. Claire had driven in from 2 counties away, braving icy back roads and the risk of exposure just to meet face to face. "You're making waves," Claire said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I've heard whispers, board members getting nervous, old cases being re-examined quietly." Emma sipped her tea, savoring the small comfort of an ally nearby. "He's planning a town forum," she said. "He's going to paint me as some kind of anarchist, make himself the victim." Claire shrugged. "Let him. You have the truth. He has spin. Truth takes longer sometimes, but it sinks deeper." Emma smiled faintly, but a knot still twisted in her gut. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice low. "You should be," Claire said without softness. "But fear's not the worst thing, silence is." After lunch, Emma returned to her apartment to find another envelope taped to her door. No address, no name, just a single sheet inside. Back off, the letters were blocky, printed in red marker. No signature, no explanation. She stood there a moment, staring at the words, letting the threat bloom fully in her mind, and then she tore it cleanly in half, dropped it in the trash, and bolted the door behind her. They were afraid. That was what mattered. At dusk, Emma sat cross-legged on the living room floor, piecing together her strategy for Friday night. She wouldn't confront Pierce directly at the forum. That was what he wanted, a shouting match he could manipulate into looking like hysteria. No, she would come armed with questions. Calm, surgical, devastating questions. Questions designed not to accuse but to reveal. She drafted them carefully on note cards, each one aimed like a knife at the heart of Pierce's public facade. "Your Honor, can you clarify your financial interest in the Whitewood Development Project? In your judicial capacity, how do you ensure impartiality when ruling on cases involving known associates? Have you ever recused yourself from cases involving direct political donors?" Questions he couldn't answer without exposing himself. Questions that would make even loyalists squirm. When she was done, she tucked the cards into her briefcase, along with everything else she might need: copies of public records, screenshots, sworn statements. By now, the stars were sharp and hard, above the town, scattered like shattered glass across the sky. Emma stood at her window, looking out over the dark rooftops, feeling something new stir inside her. Not quite peace, but something close to it. They could smear her name. They could whisper behind closed doors. They could even threaten her, but they could not erase what was true. And when the truth finally broke through, as it always did, eventually no amount of power or polish would be enough to save them. She thought of her students then, of the way their faces lit up when they understood a story's hidden meaning, when they realized that even in fiction, truth could be found if you were willing to dig deep enough. She thought of her grandfather standing firm against bullies in suits and robes, refusing to bow. She thought of every quiet voice waiting for someone, anyone, to prove it could be done. Emma turned off the lights, slipped into bed, and closed her eyes. The storm was coming, and this time she would be ready. The Westridge Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. Every seat was filled, the aisles packed with restless bodies, and still people kept trickling in, clutching folding chairs. Borrowed from the back rooms, the air inside was electric, a heavy blend of curiosity, loyalty, and something sharper: a hunger for spectacle. Emma stood near the back, pressed between a pillar and the fire exit, her grandfather's briefcase at her feet. She had dressed carefully, just like she had for court neutral colors. Modest lines, nothing that could be twisted into an accusation of arrogance or disrespect. Tonight wasn't about her pride, it was about the truth. Judge Franklin Pierce arrived precisely at 7:00 p.m., flanked by a few key town officials who wore tight, polite smiles and carried themselves like soldiers preparing for battle. His black suit was immaculate, his hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He shook hands with the mayor, nodded graciously at the school superintendent, and mounted the low stage with the ease of a man who had ruled every room he ever entered. Applause greeted him, polite but not thunderous. Emma watched the crowd carefully. Some faces were eager, some were wary. A precious few, were openly skeptical. Pierce took the podium, resting his hands lightly on the sides as he surveyed the crowd with a paternal smile. "Good citizens of Westridge," he began, his voice rich and authoritative, amplified perfectly by the microphone. "Thank you for being here tonight. It's no secret that in recent weeks there have been distractions in our community, baseless allegations, misunderstandings. Emma felt her stomach twist. He was framing it already, reasserting himself not as a man accused, but as a protector, unfairly maligned. My role, Pierce continued, has always been to uphold the law and to maintain the integrity of our institutions. In difficult times, rumors and resentment can cloud our judgment. But I urge you tonight to remember who we are, a community that respects order, tradition, and the rule of law. A few heads nodded, a few others stayed still. Emma gripped the edge of her briefcase until her knuckles ached. The moderator, a meek councilman, Emma barely recognized, opened the floor for public questions. Hands shot up immediately, and for a while the questions stayed safely within the lines: funding for local projects, updates on civic ordinances, concerns about school district taxes. Pierce answered them all with practiced ease, his voice smooth, his smile benevolent. Emma waited. She waited as the room grew warmer, as people began shifting in their seats, as impatience frayed the edges of the polite facade. And then when the moderator asked for any final questions, she raised her hand. The movement was small, but somehow it pulled every eye in the room toward her, like a magnet. Pierce's gaze found her. For a heartbeat, something flickered there. Not fear, not yet, but a tightening, a calculation. The moderator hesitated, glanced at Pierce, who gave a small, gracious nod. "You in the back," the moderator said. Emma stepped forward, her note cards in hand, her heart pounding so hard that she thought it might crack her ribs. But her voice when she spoke was clear and calm. "Your Honor," she began, "thank you for taking questions. I have a few if you don't mind." Pierce smiled thinly. "Of course, Miss Lawson, always happy to engage with concerned citizens." Her name spoken aloud rippled through the crowd like a thrown stone. The tension in the room tightened, almost audible. Emma flipped to her first card. "Your Honor, can you clarify your financial interest in the Whitewood Development Project?" The room fell utterly silent. Pierce's smile didn't falter, but his fingers tightened slightly on the podium. "I have no direct financial interest," he said smoothly. "As public records will show, I merely reside adjacent to that development. Any rumors to the contrary are unfortunate misunderstandings." Emma didn't argue. She moved to the next card. "In your judicial capacity, how do you ensure impartiality when ruling on cases involving known business associates or political contributors?" Another ripple through the crowd. Several people shifted in their seats. A few murmured under their breath. Pierce's jaw tightened. "I adhere strictly to the ethical guidelines set forth for all judges. Any suggestion otherwise is without merit." Emma flipped to another card without breaking eye contact. "Have you ever recused yourself from a case where your impartiality might reasonably be questioned?" For the first time, Pierce hesitated, a bare flicker, a heartbeat too long. "I have not found it necessary," he said carefully, "because I have always conducted myself with the highest integrity." A lie, Emma knew it, Claire knew it, Mark knew it. And somewhere deep in the crowd, the citizens of Westridge were beginning to feel it too. She reached for the last card, the one she had almost left behind, the one that cut deepest. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "can you explain why the official court records show an abnormal spike? A 400% increase in contempt charges against citizens who spoke critically about municipal projects tied to Whitewood Development, all within 6 months following public hearings in which you were present." The room exploded. Not with noise, not yet, but with movement, a collective leaning forward, an intake of breath, a gathering storm of realization. Pierce's mask cracked just for a second. His face flushed a dangerous shade of red. His fingers gripped the podium so tightly the wood creaked. "I am not here," he said sharply, "to indulge conspiracy theories." Emma stayed silent. She simply stood there, letting the question hang between them like a guillotine. Mark Chen had his phone raised, recording everything. Others in the crowd followed suit, phones flashing up like stars in the low ceiling light. Pierce saw. He saw the cameras, the witnesses, the impossibility of burying this moment, and he made his mistake. "This session is concluded," he snapped, stepping back from the podium. "No further questions." The moderator sputtered, confused. But Pierce was already walking off the stage, his entourage scrambling to catch up. People began shouting questions after him. Real questions, now angry questions, and the orderly facade shattered completely. Emma turned and walked toward the door, feeling every pair of eyes burning into her back. Not with scorn, not with pity, but with something fierce and unfamiliar. Hope outside, the air was cold and sharp against her skin. She didn't wait for Mark or Claire or anyone else. She simply kept walking, her pulse still hammering, her body trembling with the adrenaline of what she had done. Inside that room tonight, she had cracked the dam. And now nothing Judge Pierce did could patch it fast enough. The truth was out. The storm was no longer coming, and it had arrived for the first time in weeks. The streets of Westridge were alive with something Emma hadn't seen in a long time. Conversation. Real conversation. People gathered outside the coffee shop, huddled on corners, talking in hushed, urgent voices. It wasn't fear anymore. It was realization. It was the sound of a town waking up. By Saturday morning, the first article had hit. Mark Chen's piece ran under a banner headline, "In the Westridge Daily, Judge Franklin Pierce under investigation for judicial misconduct." The story was brutal in its clarity, laying out the timeline of intimidation. The financial ties, the pattern of corruption stretching back years. Emma's affidavit was quoted extensively, but it wasn't just her words anymore. Claire had provided document. Former plaintiffs, emboldened by her courage, had come forward. A local business owner even gave an on-record interview describing how Pierce had strong-armed him into dropping a zoning appeal. The paper sold out by noon. By Sunday, regional outlets picked it up. By Monday, the State Judicial Review Board announced a preliminary inquiry into Pierce's conduct. And by Tuesday, Judge Franklin Pierce, once the untouchable titan of Westridge, quietly submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons and a desire to protect the dignity of the judiciary. He was gone, just like that. Emma sat on the back steps of her apartment that evening, her legs stretched out, the wood cool against her jeans, staring up at a sky dusted with the first soft stars of spring. It didn't feel the way she thought it would. There was no victory parade, no sudden rush of joy. Instead, there was a hollow, exhausted ache, the slow, painful exhale of a burden carried too long. She hadn't done it alone. She could never pretend she had. Claire marked Diane. The quiet hands that had passed her documents whispered encouragement, filled courtroom seats to make sure she was seen, was heard. She had simply been the one stubborn enough to keep standing when the world told her to sit down. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She picked it up without checking the caller ID. "Miss Lawson," it was Principal Stevens. His voice sounded oddly formal, stiff around the edges. "Yes," she said carefully. "I wanted to inform you," he continued, "that the school board met this afternoon. They voted unanimously to reinstate you, effective immediately. All records of disciplinary action will be expunged." Emma closed her eyes briefly, the weight of it sinking in. "Thank you," she said simply. "There's more," Stevens added, and for once there was a hint of something human in his voice. "Regret, maybe shame. The superintendent, he's also stepping down. An interim is being appointed." The system hadn't just cracked, it was crumbling. After she hung up, Emma sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet thrum of life around her. The distant bark of a bell, the low hum of a passing car, the heartbeat of a town finding itself again. She thought about going back to Westridge High, about standing in front of a room full of restless teenagers, whiteboard marker in hand, talking about symbols and justice and the power hidden in ordinary words. Could she do it? Could she walk those halls without carrying the scars of this fight in every step? Maybe. Maybe not. But either way, she would stand. The next morning, she pulled into the school parking lot just before first bell. Her heart pounded in her ears as she crossed the threshold, the familiar smell of disinfectant and pencil shavings wrapping around her like an old worn blanket. Teachers glanced up as she passed. Some smiled hesitantly. A few looked away, embarrassed by their earlier silence. She didn't hold it against them. Fear made cowards of good people. That was why it was so dangerous. That was why it had to be fought. In her classroom, a whiteboard marker still sat where she had left it weeks ago. Emma picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote in thick, steady letters across the board. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing." Students began filing in, whispering and nudging each other, throwing curious glances at her. Emma turned to face them. Hard hammering, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Today," she said, "we're going to talk about courage." At the end of the day, as the last students trickled out, Diane slipped into the room, leaning against the door frame. "You did it," she said softly. Emma smiled, a real smile this time, small but unbreakable. "We did it." Diane crossed the room and pulled her into a fierce hug. "You're braver than all of us combined," she whispered. "No," Emma said, pulling back. "I just stopped waiting for someone else to fix it." Outside, spring was coming in slow, stubborn bursts. Green buds clawing their way up through frozen earth. Sunlight fighting through heavy clouds. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was a beginning. 2 weeks later, at a quiet ceremony held in the school's library, the students presented her with a framed photo, Emma standing at the front of the classroom, mid-lecture marker in hand, passion lighting up her face. Beneath it, a simple plaque. Thank you for teaching us that standing up matters. Emma ran her fingers over the frame, blinking back tears. This was why she fought. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for this, the spark in a young mind. The belief that truth was worth fighting for, even when, especially when it came at a cost. That night alone in her apartment, Emma pulled out her grandfather's old journal again. She added one final line beneath his last entry, the ink crisp and sure on the aging page. Sometimes the smallest voice can shake the tallest walls. And then she closed the book, set it carefully on the shelf, and turned toward whatever came next. Ready, unafraid, unbroken.